April 14, 1943. In a quiet operations room on the island of Oahu, a single pencil began to move across paper, translating fragments of intercepted Japanese code into English. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and silence. For weeks, the cryptanalysts of Fleet Radio Unit Pacific had been reading pieces of the Japanese Navy's most secret communication system, JN-25B, but this one was different. This message was personal. It listed a flight schedule, precise times, departure points, and the passengers. At the top of that list was a name that had become both feared and respected across the Pacific: Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The man who had orchestrated the attack on Pearl Harbor was about to take a routine inspection tour across the Solomon Islands. He would depart Rabaul at 6:00 a.m., fly south toward Bougainville, and arrive at Balal Airfield at 8:00. It was supposed to be a morale visit, one meant to encourage exhausted troops after months of bloody fighting. But now, thanks to an intercepted radio wave and the patience of American codebreakers, his precise route was known. When the decoded message reached the desk of Admiral Chester Nimitz, the decision came quietly. No celebration, no cheering, just a short conversation behind closed doors. Operation Vengeance was approved. The United States would send a flight of long-range P-38 Lightnings to intercept Yamamoto's plane over Bougainville. It would be the most daring aerial assassination attempt in history, a strike not on an army or a fleet but on a single man. Yet even as the Americans began planning, an uneasy sense of gravity hung over the room. For many of them, Yamamoto wasn't just an enemy, he was an enigma, an admiral who had studied in America, who spoke fluent English, who had warned his own government that war with the United States was unwinnable. "If I am ordered to fight," he had said years earlier, "I will run wild for 6 months. After that, I can promise nothing." His prediction had been precise. Now, 10 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan was already beginning to bleed. Its carriers lay at the bottom of the sea after Midway, and its navy stretched thin across 1,000 islands. Yamamoto knew this better than anyone. He had become the reluctant face of a war he had privately believed could not be won. Far away in Rabaul on the island of New Britain, the admiral's morning had begun like any other. He woke before dawn, as he always did, shaved carefully, and drank his coffee while looking out over the harbor. Outside his quarters, mechanics were checking the Mitsubishi G4 M Betty bombers that would carry him and his staff to Bougainville. His aides joked lightly about the journey, an hour and 40 minutes of calm skies and turquoise water. Yamamoto smiled politely but said little. He was tired. The war he had helped ignite was turning into something he could no longer control. At 5:45 a.m., he inspected the guard unit, then signed his flight order in neat, deliberate strokes. Punctuality, he reminded his officers, is the soul of discipline. None of them knew that his precision would seal his fate. On the other side of the Pacific, the P-38 pilots selected for the mission were already studying the same schedule. Every minute of Yamamoto's itinerary had been converted into airspeed, altitude, and fuel calculations. To catch him, they would need to fly more than 400 miles over open ocean, beyond radio range, without navigational beacons, and without the possibility of rescue if anything went wrong. They would have to arrive at exactly the right moment, no sooner, no later. At Pearl Harbor, the intelligence officer who first translated the message stared at the paper a long time before filing it. He understood what it meant, the end of a man who had once studied among Americans, who had admired their industry and feared their excess. He also understood something else, how fragile life had become in a war fought by machines and mathematics. Meanwhile, in Rabaul, Yamamoto's staff loaded his briefcase, uniform cap, and the ceremonial sword he carried on every flight. As his plane taxied to the runway, ground crew saluted. He returned the gesture with quiet dignity. "We shall meet again," he said to the officers, seeing him off. It sounded less like a promise than a farewell. The engines roared to life. 2 sleek bombers lifted into the morning sky, escorted by 6 Zero fighters. Within minutes, they were specks of silver above the Solomon Sea. The admiral opened his notebook and began to write. "The sea today is calm," he wrote. "A good omen." Back in the intelligence center, an American officer looked at his watch. The time difference between Rabaul and Guadalcanal was 1 hour. If everything went according to plan, the P-38S would meet Yamamoto's plane over Bougainville at 7:34 a.m. sharp. Both men, one on each side of the Pacific, believed they were following destiny. One saw it as duty, the other as vengeance. But in the quiet between those opposing missions lay a deeper truth. Neither of them would ever see the world in peace again. If you believe that in war knowledge is more powerful than bullets, type 1 in the comments. If you disagree, hit like to let me know, and don't forget to subscribe, because in the next part we'll see how Admiral Yamamoto's own sense of duty led him to a destiny no one could escape. In every war there is one man who understands its outcome long before the first battle is fought. For Japan, that man was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Long before his name became synonymous with the Pearl Harbor, before his planes carried torpedoes through the quiet Sunday morning of December 7, 1941, he had walked the tree-lined streets of Boston as a young naval attaché, fascinated by the sound of factory whistles and the rhythm of American abundance. He was not born into privilege. Yamamoto came from Nagaoka, a small farming town where winters were cruel and ambition was a luxury. He lost 2 fingers in the Battle of Tsushima, a scar he carried not as a wound, but as proof of survival. In the years that followed, he studied English poker and economics, with the same discipline he would later apply to war. He was a man who believed in precision of numbers of machines of thought. At Harvard University, he learned something few of his contemporaries ever would: the true weight of American industry. He visited automobile plants, steel mills, and shipyards, watched assembly lines move with mechanical rhythm, and realized that the United States was not a nation of warriors, it was a nation of workers. The Americans, he once said to a colleague, are like a great river. You can dam it for a time, but never stop it. That understanding made him both invaluable and dangerous within Japan's military hierarchy. He admired the spirit of Bushido but distrusted blind faith. He knew courage was no substitute for coal, that honor could not replace oil, and that no amount of will could refill an empty fuel tank. When war hawks in Tokyo demanded a preemptive strike against America, Yamamoto argued against it. "If we must fight," he said, "I will run wild for 6 months, maybe a year. But if the war continues after that, I can promise nothing." His words were ignored. By 1943, his prophecy had already come true. The Japanese Navy that had once dominated the Pacific was retreating island by island. At Midway, 4 of its proudest carriers had vanished beneath the sea in a single morning. At Guadalcanal, thousands of soldiers starved, cut off from supplies by an American blockade that grew stronger each week. Yamamoto watched it all unfold in silence. The empire was shrinking, and with it, the illusion of invincibility that Tokyo had built on propaganda and faith. To his men, he remained the image of calm authority. But in private, he confided his despair to his aides. "We have awakened a sleeping giant," he said, and filled him with a terrible resolve. It was not a boast, it was a confession. He understood what his peers refused to see, that Japan's industrial power, limited by geography and resources, could never match the scale of the American war machine. For every zero lost, America would build 3 more fighters. For every destroyer sunk, America would launch another within months. Yamamoto had studied the numbers. He believed in mathematics more than miracles. Still, duty bound him to lead. To the Japanese people, that he was a hero, a symbol of victory, the mind behind Pearl Harbor, the man who had humiliated the West. To himself, he was something else entirely, a soldier performing the role history demanded of him, even as he suspected it would end in tragedy. On the evening of April 17, 1943, Yamamoto reviewed reports from the Solomon Islands. Morale was faltering. Supplies were dwindling. His subordinates begged him not to fly the next morning. Intelligence warned of possible ambushes. But he waved the concern aside. If I do not go, he told them, how can I ask others to die? He spent that night writing letters, one to his wife, another to his eldest son, and a third to a friend in Tokyo who had once studied with him in Boston. The letters were brief, written with the precision of a man accustomed to order. I hope you are well, one line read. The war will not be long now. It will end soon, one way or another. At dawn, his aide found him already awake, standing by the window of his quarters. The early light touched the metals on his uniform. It is a fine day for flying, he said softly. He looked out toward the harbor where his transport aircraft waited, its engines still silent. For a moment, his expression softened, not pride, not fear, but a quiet acceptance. He was a man trapped between two worlds, the modern logic of machines and the ancient loyalty of samurai. His mind was American in method, but his heart was Japanese in duty. Perhaps that was his tragedy, that he understood both sides too well. As the sun rose higher, the sound of aircraft echoed across Rabaul. Mechanics saluted, officers assembled, and Yamamoto walked to his plane with measured steps. His staff noticed he carried only a small leather briefcase and a short sword. No luggage, no personal effects. Travel light, he had said. We will return by evening. History would later call him a tactician, a genius, a gambler. But on that morning he was simply a man of fate, aware that destiny had chosen him not as a victor but as an example. If you believe Yamamoto was not a villain but a soldier bound by duty, type 2 in the comments. If you see him as the architect of tragedy, like to let me know. And subscribe, because in the next part we'll uncover how the Americans, miles away and armed only with mathematics, planned the most precise ambush in aviation history. At Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the tropical air was heavy with rain and tension. Pilots from the 339th Fighter Squadron were summoned without warning to the operations tent. Maps were spread across the table, their corners held down by mugs of cold coffee. No one knew why they'd been called. When Major John Mitchell, the squadron commander, walked in, carrying a sealed envelope, conversation stopped. He looked at the men, most of them young, some barely 20, and said quietly, "Gentlemen, this is going to sound unbelievable, but if we pull it off, it'll be talked about long after this war is over." Inside the envelope was a decoded message. It had traveled from Pearl Harbor to Admiral Halsey's headquarters and finally to Guadalcanal under strictest secrecy. Mitchell unfolded the paper. It contained coordinates, times, and headings, all traced from a single Japanese transmission intercepted 3 days earlier. The message detailed the travel schedule of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then one pilot muttered what everyone was thinking, "You mean we're going to shoot down the man who started this war?" Mitchell nodded. "Those are our orders. Operation Vengeance. We're to intercept and destroy his aircraft near Bougainville. We'll have no radio contact, no fighter escort, and no second chances." The room filled with an uneasy silence. Even for men hardened by months of combat, this was different. This wasn't an attack on a base or a convoy, it was an assassination. Lieutenant Rex Barber later recalled thinking, "It felt strange. We weren't soldiers anymore. We were executioners." Planning began immediately. The mission's success depended entirely on mathematics. Yamamoto's flight would leave Rabaul at 6:00 a.m. Tokyo time, fly the 315 miles southeast to Bougainville, and arrive at 8:00. Adjusting for time zones, Mitchell's P-38S would have to take off at 7:00 a.m. local time and fly 400 miles over open water at wave-top level to avoid radar detection. They would reach the interception point within seconds of Yamamoto's arrival or miss him completely. Fuel calculations were merciless. The P-38 Lightning had long range, but even with drop tanks, the pilots would be flying at the edge of endurance. There would be no opportunity to circle, no chance to return if lost. The margin of error was less than 5 minutes. To ensure secrecy, the orders were handwritten. The men were forbidden to tell even their mechanics where they were going. Only 16 pilots would know the target, and even among them, the name Yamamoto was never spoken aloud. They called him simply the Visitor. That night, Mitchell gathered his men one last time. The airfield was quiet except for the hum of generators and the distant sound of rain hitting tin roofs. "We'll be flying at 50 feet, he said. "Keep your formation tight. We'll climb only when we're within range. If we do this right, it'll be over in 2 minutes." He paused. "If we're wrong, it'll be over in 1. Far to the north in Rabaul, Yamamoto was reviewing his own schedule with his staff. He was punctual, almost obsessively so. When his adjutant suggested delaying departure due to possible air activity, he shook his head. "A commander who hides behind fear," he said, "is already defeated." He did not know that this devotion to discipline was exactly what the Americans were counting on. At 4:00 a.m. Guadalcanal time, ground crews began preparing the P-38ES. Mechanics moved silently in the dark, checking oil levels and loading ammunition belts. The mission had no room for error. Each engine, each fuel line, each bolt had to perform perfectly. The pilots climbed into their cockpits just before sunrise. The air smelled of salt and gasoline. Rex Barber adjusted his oxygen mask and looked out at the horizon. Somewhere beyond that dark line lay Bougainville, and a man who, by all logic, should have been unreachable. At 7:00 sharp, the engines started. 16 planes rolled down the wet runway and lifted into the morning haze. Once airborne, they fell into perfect formation, twin booms glinting in the rising sun. Mitchell's voice came softly over the radio. "All units maintain silence from here on out." Then nothing. Below them, the Pacific stretched endlessly. Flying at 50 feet, the P-38S skimmed over the water, leaving faint wakes behind them. The roar of engines blended into a constant metallic hum. They flew not by instruments, but by instinct, navigating through a world of blue and gray, trusting in numbers scribbled on a piece of paper. As they crossed the halfway point, one of the pilots glanced at his fuel gauge and realized they were burning faster than expected. Mitchell recalculated on the fly, adjusting speed and altitude to save every possible drop. It was a mission of precision, where even the wind could be an enemy. At 9:25, after 2.5 hours of silence, the coastline of Bougainville appeared ahead, dense jungle rivers glinting like broken glass. The men checked their watches. If the timing was correct, Yamamoto's plane would be arriving in less than 5 minutes. Somewhere above those same jungles, the Admiral was writing in his notebook. He noted the weather, the calm sea, the small islands below. "A fine morning," he wrote. "I hope the men at the front are in good spirits." His aide, Major Sugita, leaned toward him. "Sir, should we radio ahead to Balale for confirmation?" Yamamoto smiled faintly. "Unnecessary. They will be ready." It was the calm before an invisible storm. Back in the American formation, Mitchell raised his hand and pointed east. "There," he mouthed. The radarless intercept had worked. Tiny glints of sunlight reflected off Japanese aircraft ahead. 6 zeros above 2 bombers below, exactly as intelligence had predicted. The hunters had found their prey. At that moment, neither side knew they were part of something much larger than vengeance. This was not just the meeting of 2 aircraft formations. It was the collision of 2 philosophies, the Japanese faith in discipline and honor against the American faith in calculation and production. One believed in destiny, the other believed in data. And in less than 3 minutes, one of them would end. If you believe that intelligence can decide the fate of nations, type 3 in the comments. If you think luck decides more than logic, hit like. And subscribe, because in the next part, we'll fly alongside the P-38S as they climb into the ambush that would change the course of the Pacific War. The Pacific stretched below them like a sheet of hammered steel, endless, shimmering, and cruelly indifferent. 16 P-38 Lightnings moved in perfect formation, barely 50 feet above the waves, their propeller tips biting into the humid air. The roar of twin Allison engines filled the cockpits, but inside their helmets, each pilot heard something else, the sound of his own breathing, the metronome of fear counting down the miles to destiny. For 2.5 hours, they had flown without speaking. The radio silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional crackle of static. Every man on that mission knew that a single transmission could betray them to Japanese patrols. They were ghosts skimming the surface of the ocean, visible to no one, guided only by a compass, a stopwatch, and trust in their commander's calculations. Rex Barber stole a glance at his fuel gauge. The needle was lower than he liked. He made a small adjustment to throttle, feeling the vibration through his gloves. The sun had risen high now, throwing sharp reflections off the water that blinded him momentarily. Sweat collected behind his oxygen mask. They were flying toward Bougainville, but it felt as though the world itself had stopped turning. Ahead of them, Major John Mitchell kept his eyes on the horizon. The weight of command pressed heavy on his shoulders. One miscalculation, one deviation of course, by even a single degree, and the entire operation would unravel. They had no navigation beacons, no radar, and no rescue if they went down, only distance, time, and faith. He looked down and imagined the ocean beneath as a graveyard, thousands of feet deep where sunlight faded into black silence. The Pacific was littered with aircraft that had run out of luck or fuel. He forced the thought away. Discipline was survival. At 8:45 a.m., the formation passed over a small island, Choiseul. It was the only landmark between them and Bougainville. From here, the approach had to be perfect. Mitchell checked his watch. They were still on schedule, barely. The pilots could feel the pressure building like static electricity. There was no music, no chatter, nothing to dull the awareness that they were flying to kill one man. Even for hardened combat veterans, it was an unsettling thought. In training, they had learned to destroy enemy machines, not to execute a human being. But orders were orders, and the name Isoroku Yamamoto carried a shadow long enough to darken every heart in the Pacific. Barber thought about Pearl Harbor. He remembered the flames, the headlines, the photographs of burning ships. He told himself that this mission would avenge those dead sailors, that it was justice, not murder. Still, part of him wondered what kind of man they were really hunting. Reports said Yamamoto had studied in America, had played poker with U.S. officers, had even admired American industry. How strange, Barber thought, that a man who understood us so well would lead a war against us. The air grew thinner as they climbed slightly to clear a line of low clouds. Sunlight broke through, painting the ocean with blinding gold. The formation stretched for miles, 16 silver specks moving in silence through an empty world. Mitchell gave a hand signal barely visible in the glare. The final descent would begin soon. They were entering the danger zone. Fuel reserves were tight. There would be no chance for a second attempt. Back in Rabaul, the man they sought was fastening the straps of his seat harness. Yamamoto's G-4M Betty bomber sat gleaming on the runway, flanked by its escort of Zero fighters. The Admiral's aide, Major Sugita, checked his watch. 6 o'clock exactly, sir, he said. Yamamoto nodded, expression calm. A commander should never keep his men waiting. The engines coughed to life, throwing up clouds of dust. As the plane lifted off, he gazed out the window at the fading outline of Rabaul's harbor. He thought of the men he would meet at Bougainville. Young soldiers living in mud, starving on half rations, still saluting the rising sun with unwavering devotion. He wanted to look them in the eyes, to tell them Japan had not forgotten them. Perhaps deep down he knew it was a lie meant to comfort himself. Back over the sea, the P-38Es were closing in on the rendezvous point. They had been airborne for nearly 3 hours. The constant drone of engines had become a kind of hypnosis sound without meaning. Some pilots tried not to think at all. Others prayed silently, mouthing words no one would ever hear. Mitchell checked his watch again. 3 minutes until intercept. He felt the air grow warmer, the horizon clearer. Bougainville lay ahead, dark green mountains rising from the sea like the spine of a sleeping beast. They were exactly on time. He tapped the clock on his instrument panel once gently as if to thank it. Then he raised his hand, signaling the final formation change. The flight split into 2 groups, one to cover high, one to attack low. No words were spoken. The mission had crossed a boundary where human voices no longer belonged. The air vibrated with purpose. Somewhere beyond that horizon, Yamamoto's bomber was slicing through the same sky, unaware that destiny had already taken flight to meet him. Every pilot tightened his grip on the control column. No one looked back. The Pacific below shimmered like glass, hiding the abyss. Ahead, the morning sun hung low and white, blinding, merciless. The hunt was about to begin. If you believe that some missions are carried not by hatred but by duty, type 4 in the comments. If you think vengeance can never be justice, hit like. And subscribe, because in the next part we'll enter the sky over Bougainville, where a few seconds of gunfire decided the fate of two nations. At 9:34 a.m., the stillness over Bougainville shattered. The jungle below was drenched in light, the air warm and heavy with the smell of salt and rain. From the west, 16 specks appeared against the blinding sun, so small at first that the Japanese lookouts along the coast mistook them for seabirds. But as the roar deepened and multiplied, their mistake became clear. Two Mitsubishi G4 Betty bombers flew in tight formation, flanked by 6 agile Zero fighters. Inside the lead bomber sat Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, reading through a folder of personnel reports. The flight had been smooth, almost serene. When his aide, Major Sugita, glanced out the window and said, "Sir, we're approaching Bougainville," Yamamoto nodded with quiet satisfaction. "Excellent. Inform them we'll land in 15 minutes. That was when the escort leader's voice cracked over the radio, "Enemy aircraft, high and to the right." In the next instant, the morning sky erupted. The P-38S had come in from the northeast, exactly as calculated, their long silver wings slicing through the haze. They descended like hawks, silent until the final second. Then came the roar engines. Straining guns armed the metallic scream of error over aluminum. Major John Mitchell led the dive, pointing his plane toward the glinting forms ahead. "Target confirmed," he said quietly to no one in particular. "Let's finish this." Rex Barber, flying slightly behind, spotted the twin-engine bombers through his gun sight. They gleamed pale green against the jungle canopy. His heartbeat quickened, but his hands stayed steady. Training took over. Throttle forward, nose down. Range closing 800 yards, 600, 400. The Japanese formation reacted instantly. The Zeros broke into a defensive spiral, their pilots shouting into their radios. Below them, Yamamoto's bomber began to bank, left its engines straining. Barber pressed the trigger. A stream of .50 caliber bullets ripped through the morning sky. Tracer rounds arced forward, catching the sunlight like comets. He saw the hits immediately, holes blossoming across the bomber's right wing, smoke trailing from the engine. Flames licked across the cowling bright orange against the green fuselage. Inside, the G4M chaos replaced calm. The first burst shattered the instrument panel, sending shards of glass into the crew. Alarms screamed. The right engine coughed, sputtered, then burst into flame. Sugita turned to the admiral, shouting over the noise, "Sir, we've been hit." Yamamoto didn't move. His face was expressionless, calm in the inferno of sound and motion. The plane shuddered violently as it began to lose altitude. He reached for his gloves, pulled them tight, and said softly, almost to himself, "So it ends here." Barber pulled up sharply, avoiding debris that tore away from the burning bomber. Behind him, Lieutenant Thomas Lanphier engaged the escorting Zeros, his tracers slashing across the sky. One Japanese fighter exploded in a burst of flame, another spiraled into the jungle below. The battle lasted less than 2 minutes, 2 minutes that would echo through history. Yamamoto's bomber, trailing smoke and fire, descended toward the jungle canopy. Witnesses on the ground later described seeing it glide almost gracefully, wings level, before disappearing into the trees with a dull final crash. The explosion never came. The plane simply vanished into the green. The second bomber, carrying Chief of Staff Ugaki, tried to climb, desperate to escape. Barber turned and fired again, riddling its fuselage with bullets. It fell in a long, slow arc and struck the sea, breaking apart on impact. In the silence that followed, the P-38 pilots circled briefly, scanning the wreckage. Mitchell's voice came over the intercom, calm and distant. "Mission complete. Form up and head home." There was no cheer, no victory cry, just a long, collective exhale. Rex Barber looked down at the burning jungle. Smoke rose in thin gray ribbons through the canopy. He knew the man below had once studied, in his country had walked streets not unlike his own. "It's done," he whispered. But even as he said it, a strange hollowness settled in his chest. Hours later, when search teams from the Japanese garrison reached the crash site, they found the wreck deep in the forest, the nose buried in earth, the tail sheared away. The bodies were still inside. Yamamoto remained seated in his chair, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his sword, his white gloves untouched by dirt. A single bullet had pierced his heart. Death had been instant. They carried him out wrapped in a white sheet. Soldiers knelt in silence as his body passed their faces blank with disbelief. "It cannot be," one officer murmured. "The Admiral always returns, but this time he would not." Word of the loss reached Tokyo days later. The government hesitated to announce it. Even in defeat, Yamamoto was too important, too symbolic. For 3 weeks, they concealed the truth, hoping to find words equal to the enormity of the loss. When the news finally broke, Japan fell silent. Factories stopped for a minute of mourning. Radios played solemn music. Soldiers bowed their heads. To the Americans, Operation Vengeance was a success, a triumph of intelligence planning and precision. To the Japanese, it was something else entirely. It was the day the sun dimmed, the day faith began to falter. In Rabaul, officers who had served under Yamamoto wept openly. One young pilot, barely 20, wrote in his diary, "He was not a god. He was a man. And now we are alone." When the American pilots landed back on Guadalcanal, their hands were still shaking from the adrenaline. Mechanics rushed to meet them, eager for news. "Did you get him one?" asked. Mitchell nodded once. "Yes, it's over." But in the quiet that followed, none of them smiled. There was no victory to taste, no celebration to hold. They had ended a life, not won a battle. Each man knew it. That night, Barber sat alone by the airfield watching the sun sink into the ocean. He thought about the man they'd killed, the mind behind Pearl Harbor, the strategist who had nearly broken America, the scholar who had once walked freely among them. "We didn't kill an enemy," he thought. "We killed understanding itself." History would remember it as the perfect mission, but for those who flew it, perfection had never felt so heavy. If you believe that war destroys not only lives, but also understanding, type 5 in the comments. If you believe justice sometimes demands unbearable choices, hit like, and subscribe, because in the next part, we'll descend into the aftermath where grief, propaganda, and truth collided in the ashes over the Pacific. The news reached Tokyo like a whisper no one wanted to hear. It began as a rumor among naval staff officers, then trickled upward through coded dispatches that grew more cautious with each retelling. By the time the message reached the Imperial Palace, it had already been softened into half-truths. Contact lost with the Admiral's plane. Search in progress. No one dared say the words aloud. Yamamoto was dead. In the war rooms of the Navy Ministry, silence settled like dust. Maps hung untouched on the walls, the red lines of advance now little more than fading symbols of pride. Admiral Koga, Yamamoto's deputy, stood by the window staring at the rain. "He told them he would return by evening," he murmured. And now the evening has no light. The government suppressed the report for weeks. They feared what it would do to a nation already exhausted by years of sacrifice. Factories still worked around the clock, but production was slowing. The rice rations had been cut again. Mothers sent their sons to war with quiet tears and empty cupboards. The death of Yamamoto, if confirmed, would strike deeper than any bomb. In late May 1943, when Tokyo finally announced his passing, the country stopped. Radio stations played soft military hymns. Workers in shipyards stood still, caps removed. Students in uniform bowed toward the east. Even in the most remote villages, people gathered before makeshift shrines, photographs of the Admiral surrounded by candles and chrysanthemums. He had become more than a commander. He was the face of their hope. At Rabaul, where his journey had begun, a memorial service was held under gray skies. Soldiers lined the runway, their boots sinking into wet soil. They carried his coffin draped in the rising sun flag, its edges darkened with jungle mud. The aircraft that had once carried him to battle now stood silent, their engines covered against the rain. One officer whispered, "He left in sunlight and returned in shadow." When the funeral procession reached Tokyo, the streets were lined for miles. Over 100,000 people came to watch. Some cried openly, others stood in stunned quiet, as if the air itself had grown too heavy to breathe. His widow Reiko sat beneath a black veil, her hands folded in her lap. She had received his final letters only days before, brief, formal, affectionate, and oddly calm. "Take care of our garden," one line read. "It will need you more than I will." At the funeral, Emperor Hirohito appeared in full dress uniform, his face expressionless but pale. As the hymn ended, he stepped forward, placed a white chrysanthemum upon the coffin, and bowed his head. No words were spoken. There were none left that could carry the weight of what Japan had lost. In the weeks that followed, the Imperial Navy's morale fractured. Officers still shouted orders, ships still sailed, but the invisible thread that had bound them was gone. Yamamoto had been the one figure who could speak of defeat without fear, who could question strategy without being accused of disloyalty. Without him, the silence inside the Navy grew absolute. Among ordinary soldiers, the grief was more personal. On the island fronts, men built small shrines from shell casings and driftwood, carving his name into pieces of coral. He watches us still, one pilot wrote in his diary before flying his final mission. "If he could not return, then neither shall I." But even amid mourning, doubt began to bloom. Some whispered that Yamamoto had known his death was coming, that he had accepted it as atonement for the war he had helped begin. Others called his death a punishment from the gods for defying destiny. No one spoke of the Americans who had brought him down, only of the inevitability of fate. In the Pacific jungles, the wreckage of his plane remained untouched for months. The trees had begun to reclaim its vines, curling through the torn fuselage roots, splitting open the aluminum skin. Locals who visited the site said it felt like walking into a temple. The air was still the forest, soundless. Only the faint smell of oil lingered, mixed with the sweet scent of earth and decay. One Japanese officer who visited the crash site after the war wrote, "There was no hatred there, only quiet. It was as if the jungle itself had bowed its head." For the Americans, Operation Vengeance became a textbook example of precision warfare, proof that intelligence and production could shape the outcome of a global conflict. But for the Japanese, it became something else, a lesson written in ashes. The empire had lost not just a leader, but the last man who could see both sides of the war, the industrial and the human, the logical and the loyal. Tokyo's newspapers printed his portrait across entire pages. The firm mouth, the measured eyes, the two missing fingers that had once held a deck of poker cards at Harvard. Beneath it ran a simple headline, "The spirit of Yamamoto lives on." But even those who printed it knew the spirit had already departed, taking with it whatever remained of Japan's hope for victory. By the end of 1943, the tide had turned completely. American bombers struck deeper into Japanese-held territory. The once proud fleet hid in shadowed bays, waiting for fuel that never came. Yamamoto's prediction had been right. The giant he warned about was fully awake now, moving across the ocean with factories instead of swords. A junior officer aboard the battleship Musashi summed it up in a single line of his journal, "We still fight, but the Admiral's death showed us the truth. The war is already lost. We just haven't been told yet." That truth lingered unspoken like the faint smoke over Bougainville where his plane had fallen. If you believe that some losses reveal more truth than victories, ever could type 6 in the comments. If you believe silence can say what words cannot hit like. And subscribe, because in the final part we'll look beyond the tragedy to the meaning hidden inside it, how America won not only through bullets, but through production, abundance, and mercy. The war that Yamamoto had warned against did not end with his death, it accelerated. The machine he had feared most, the industrial engine of the United States, was now fully awake. Across the Pacific, the night glowed orange from the furnaces of California and Detroit. Factories that once built cars now turned out bombers, destroyers, and engines by the tens of thousands. Women worked night shifts, children collected scrap metal, and farmers harvested not only crops, but fuel for the machines of war. In Washington, the men who had studied Yamamoto's mind understood what he had tried to tell his own government, that the modern battlefield would not be decided by courage alone, but by capacity. It was not the sword, but the assembly line that would shape the world to come. For every Japanese Zero that rolled out of a hangar, 10 American fighters took flight. For every destroyer Japan launched, the United States built a fleet. And behind each weapon stood something Yamamoto had admired and feared: the discipline of democracy, a nation whose factories ran on cooperation rather than obedience. By 1944, the Pacific was no longer a battlefield of equals. It was an equation, and the answer had already been written in steel and oil. The United States produced more aircraft engines in a single year than Japan did in the entire war. While Japanese mechanics scavenged parts from wrecks, American assembly lines worked with mathematical precision. The men who had once been farmers' clerks and machinists became soldiers in a new kind of war, the war of production. Yamamoto had seen it coming. Long before his death, he had written to a friend in Tokyo, "We are fighting an enemy who measures time not in minutes, but in machines. Every hour they grow stronger." Yet what he could never have imagined was how that strength would be used. After his death, the war turned darker, more desperate. The firebombing of Tokyo, the island sieges, the kamikaze attacks, all of it seemed to prove that humanity itself was being consumed by its inventions. But amid that firestorm, something else began to emerge, an understanding that power without restraint was no victory at all. When the war finally ended in August 1945, it did not end with a glorious battle. It ended with silence. In that silence, the prophecy of Yamamoto came true, not his 6 months of triumph, but the reckoning he had foreseen. Japan, a nation built on devotion and sacrifice, had been defeated not by soldiers, but by systems. The sky above Tokyo was filled with the hum of bombers that Japan could no longer touch. The Pacific, once theirs to command, had become a sea of American steel. And yet within that overwhelming force, there was mercy. In the ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, American doctors treated Japanese children. In villages where the rice fields lay burned and the wells were dry, U.S. naval officers shared rations with civilians. The victors who had unleashed unimaginable destruction now turned to rebuild what they had broken. For every weapon they had forged, they now sent a ship of food, a crate of medicine, a promise of peace. It was this paradox that defined the end of the war, how a nation capable of such violence could also choose compassion. Yamamoto, who had known both sides of that nation, would have understood it. He had seen America's heart before he ever saw its guns. He knew that the same factories which built bombers could build bridges, that the same minds which designed machines of war could create machines of mercy. In 1946, a small American delegation visited Nagaoka Yamamoto's hometown. The city had been heavily bombed, its schools and shrines reduced to ash. But among the rubble, the people carried photographs of the Admiral worn faded, but held with reverence. The Americans came not as conquerors, but as neighbors. They brought flour, medical supplies, and a letter of condolence from an officer who had once fought against Yamamoto's fleet. One of the townspeople, an elderly teacher, said softly, "He knew this would happen. He told us that war is not won by hatred." In the years that followed, Japan transformed. Its weapons factories became car plants. Its engineers turned from torpedoes to transistors, and its people rebuilt their country with the same discipline that had once fueled war. But this time, the energy was directed toward peace. The story of Yamamoto's death faded into textbooks, but its meaning endured. He had been both architect and prophet, both destroyer and dreamer. He died believing that numbers and machines would decide the war. He was right. But what came after proved something deeper: that victory without compassion is hollow, and power without mercy is only another kind of defeat. In a declassified memo written after the war, an American intelligence officer who had helped plan Operation Vengeance reflected on the mission. "We killed a man who might have ended the war sooner had he lived long enough to be heard," he wrote. But perhaps he serves better in death as a reminder of what happens when reason is silenced by pride. Decades later, when veterans from both sides met at memorials in the Pacific, they spoke not of vengeance, but of understanding. A former P-38 pilot who had taken part in the ambush said quietly, "We didn't hate him. We just wanted it to stop." His Japanese counterpart nodded. "So did he," he replied. The jungle where Yamamoto's plane fell is silent now. The wreckage has rusted into the soil and wildflowers grow through the twisted metal. The birds sing again. If you listen closely, the forest seems to breathe with the memory of that morning, a moment when one man's fate became the reflection of an entire century. In the end, the war that began with surprise attacks and hatred ended with factories and forgiveness. It proved what Yamamoto had known all along, that America's greatest weapon was not its guns or ships, but its capacity to create, to rebuild, to show mercy even in triumph. America did not win by bullets alone. It won by abundance, by organization, by the relentless belief that even in destruction there can be renewal. And for all the machinery and mathematics that defined the conflict, it was mercy, the rarest form of strength, that gave victory its meaning. If you believe mercy is stronger than vengeance, type 7 in the comments. If you believe creation is the only true answer to destruction, hit like. And remember to subscribe so together we can uncover more forgotten truth stories that remind us that even in war, humanity endures. At dawn on March 3, 1943, the Bismarck Sea lay quiet under a pale sky streaked with clouds. The air was calm, the kind of morning that made sailors believe the ocean itself was at peace. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura stood on the bridge of his flagship, the destroyer Shirayuki, watching 8 destroyers escort 8 fully loaded transport ships through the waters off northern New Guinea. The convoy carried the 51st Division 6 900 soldiers promised to Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi at Lai. To Kimura, this was not just another mission. It was the pulse of Japan's empire, a line of lifeblood stretching across the Pacific. For over a year, the Imperial Japanese Navy had ruled these waters. Convoys moved under the cover of experienced destroyers, anti-aircraft crews trained to perfection, and air cover from Rabaul. There had been close calls, but no real disasters. The officers on Kimura's bridge had seen American bombers before high-altitude B-17s that dropped their payloads harmlessly into the sea torpedo planes that came in low and slow, easy prey for concentrated fire. Doctrine had proven reliable, and experience had taught them confidence. "The Americans are clumsy," one gunnery officer muttered. "They attack from where we expect them to." Kimura nodded in quiet agreement. His convoy moved in textbook formation, destroyers in a protective ring, transport steady in the middle, each maintaining exact spacing and speed. It was a portrait of discipline, precision, and faith in the Imperial Navy's methods. Below decks, the soldiers of the 51st Division shared that same belief. They were young men from Osaka, Sapporo, and Kyoto, many barely 20. Some were singing softly, others writing quick notes home. The air smelled of diesel fuel and tobacco. In the mess, one soldier laughed as he tried to balance a cup of tea on the swaying table. To them, this voyage was a brief passage before the real fight on the jungled hills of New Guinea. They trusted their officers, their navy, and their empire. None could imagine that the sea around them would soon become a furnace. At 0600 hours, Kimura studied the horizon through his binoculars. The sun was climbing and the ocean glowed gold. 8 transports followed in perfect line, their wakes tracing white ribbons across the water. The destroyers flanked them like loyal wolves guarding the herd. The admiral took pride in that sight, order, discipline, and purpose. He had no reason to think this mission would end differently from the dozens before it. Intelligence had warned of American reconnaissance aircraft in the area, but the reports were vague. Japanese doctrine dismissed such threats as manageable. After all, the Americans had shown little ability to stop supply convoys. The Navy's umbrella of steel had worked again and again. Yet, beneath that calm surface, fate was moving. Hundreds of miles to the south, on dusty airstrips in Australia, American and Australian crews were loading bombs and ammunition into modified B-25 Mitchell bombers machines unlike anything Kimura's men had ever faced. In a few hours, those bombers would rise into the sky, cross the coastline, and bring with them a new kind of warfare, one born not in strategy meetings but in the minds of field mechanics and desperate innovators. For now, though, the Japanese sailors believed in routine. Anti-aircraft gunners checked their weapons' cleaned lenses and loaded magazines. Signalmen scanned the skies. Officers reviewed formation charts, confident that their training could handle anything. It was an illusion of control, a brief calm before history changed its rules. The radio on Shirayuki's bridge crackled with reports of light cloud cover, good visibility, and no enemy contacts. Kimura folded his hands behind his back and allowed himself a small smile. His convoy was on schedule. The Imperial Navy had done this many times. What he could not know, what no Japanese officer could possibly imagine, was that innovation and industrial power were about to rewrite the laws of naval warfare. The American bombers that would soon appear were not ordinary aircraft. They carried no torpedoes, no delicate bomb sights, no hesitation. They had been transformed into flying gunships, weapons of precision, and raw mechanical fury. By the time Kimura's lookouts spotted them, it would already be too late. The calm of the Bismarck Sea would shatter, and within 15 minutes, the convoy that had seemed so orderly, so invincible, would become a floating graveyard of fire and oil. If you believe Admiral Kimura was right to trust his experience, type 1 in the comments. If you think he was already doomed by his own confidence, hit like. And remember to subscribe for more true stories from the hidden battles of World War II. While Admiral Kimura's convoy moved confidently through the Bismarck Sea, the true storm was being prepared hundreds of miles to the south in the choking heat of an Australian workshop. The place was Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane, a cluster of tin-roofed hangars, red dust, and the smell of hot oil. It was here, far from any design bureau or factory line, that a restless American officer named Major Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn was about to change the nature of aerial warfare. Gunn was not a conventional man. He had been a Navy pilot before joining the Army Air Forces, a mechanic before he was a commander, and a problem solver before anyone gave him permission to be one. The Pacific War had taught him a brutal truth. High-altitude bombing against ships simply did not work. Bombs missed as torpedoes malfunctioned, and too many pilots died trying to hit moving targets from thousands of feet above the sea. Every convoy that slipped through meant more American soldiers killed on the beaches of New Guinea. Gunn refused to accept that. His answer was radical. If high-altitude bombs could not hit ships, then the bombers themselves would have to become the weapons. He began with the North American B-25 Mitchell, a sturdy twin-engine medium bomber that was never designed for ship attacks. Gunn rolled one into his hangar, stripped the paint off its nose, and ordered his crew to tear out everything inside the bombardier's seat. The Norden bomb sight, the glass panels, the wiring, everything that didn't contribute to firepower. "We're not aiming from 10,000 feet anymore," he said, pacing in the dust, cigarette hanging from his lip. "We're aiming down the barrel." His mechanics hesitated. They had no blueprints, no manuals, and no authorization from higher command. But Gunn's conviction was contagious. He and his team began welding steel plates into the nose, reinforcing the frame to absorb recoil. Then they mounted two Browning .50 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing 850 rounds per minute. 2 guns became 4. 4 became 6. By the time they were finished, 8 long barrels protruded from the B-25's nose like the fangs of a metallic beast. Each gun required its own ammunition feed and charging mechanism. The team scavenged belts from wrecked aircraft, modified feed chutes, and built boxes that could hold 400 rounds per gun. The wiring had to be rerouted through the cockpit, allowing the pilot to fire all 8 guns with a single trigger. The added weight, over 500 pounds of steel and ammunition, shifted the aircraft's balance forward. Gunn recalculated the trim himself, adjusting counterweights and fuel distribution until the plane flew level again. When he was done, the bomber looked less like a precision instrument and more like an airborne chainsaw. The test flight came at dawn. The modified B-25 taxied out onto the red dirt runway, its engines coughing thick smoke into the air. Gunn climbed into the cockpit wearing grease-stained coveralls instead of a flight suit. As the aircraft lifted off the ground, crew covered their ears. At 500 feet above the practice range, Gunn leveled out and pressed the trigger. The nose erupted in light and sound, 8 streams of fire converging into a single roar. The vibration shook the entire airframe, the recoil thrumming through the fuselage like a living pulse. Spent shells cascaded from the sides, bouncing off the wings like brass rain. When he landed, the grin on his face said everything. "She doesn't bomb anymore," he said. "She eats ships." Word spread quickly through the 5th Air Force. Pilots who saw the demonstration could not believe what they had witnessed. One observer compared it to a destroyer turned sideways and given wings. Another said simply, "That's not a bomber, it's a buzzsaw." Within weeks, field modification teams across Australia began copying Gunn's design. Reinforcement plates were welded in place, ammunition storage expanded, and electrical firing circuits standardized. The Americans had created something completely new, a medium bomber reborn as a gunship. The firepower was staggering. 8.50 caliber machine guns firing together unleashed 6 800 rounds per minute. Each round weighed nearly an ounce and traveled at 910 feet per second, fast enough to punch through armor plating. The M8 armor-piercing incendiary rounds ignited on contact, burning at 3000 degrees Fahrenheit. A 2-second burst from one of these modified B-25s could shred the superstructure of a destroyer, destroy anti-aircraft guns, and kill exposed crews before they even returned fire. Pilots began to refer to the aircraft by a new nickname, the Strafer. For comparison, most Japanese destroyers carried no more than 6 deck-mounted 25 mm guns. A single Strafer could deliver more forward-facing firepower than an entire escort ship. At close range, its guns didn't just damage targets, they carved through steel like a saw blade. One American mechanic described the sound during tests. It wasn't gunfire anymore, it was a mechanical scream. General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, visited Eagle Farm to witness the new weapon himself. After the demonstration, he reportedly turned to his aide and said, "We'll make 100 of these if we can. They'll tear Japan's lifeline to pieces." Gunn's improvisation received official approval. North American aviation began integrating the 8-gun modification into new production models. But for now, the field conversions would fight first. The newly formed 3rd Attack Group, nicknamed the Grim Reapers, would fly them. In early 1943, Gunn's Strafer bombers were ready for combat. Their aluminum skins bore hand-painted names, Ruthless, Dirty Dora Hell's Angel. Each one carried not just guns, but a new philosophy. The pilots trained low, flying just above the treetops, learning to skim wave crests and attack from the horizon. They were told, get close enough to see the whites of their eyes. It wasn't just bravado, it was survival. At that height, a single mistake meant death, but success meant annihilating the enemy before he could react. What began as one man's field experiment was about to unleash mechanical terror on the Pacific. The Japanese Navy had no idea that its trusted convoy routes were about to become slaughter zones. If you think this kind of battlefield innovation could only happen in war-type genius, in the comments. If you believe luck mattered more than invention hit like. And don't forget to subscribe. The next chapter reveals how these flying monsters learned to skip bombs across the sea. As the newly modified B-25 Strafer gunships rolled out of the Australian workshops, a second innovation was taking shape just a few hundred miles away. It didn't involve more guns or new engines, but a daring new way to use the oldest weapon in the airman's arsenal, the bomb. The man behind it was Major William Benn of the 43rd Bombardment Group, a quiet, methodical officer who had grown tired of watching high-altitude bombing runs miss every moving ship they aimed at. The Pacific was too wide, the weather too unpredictable, and Japanese captains were simply too skilled at maneuvering out of the way. Ben's idea sounded almost foolish the first time he described it. What if he said during a briefing at Port Moresby, "We make the bomb skip"? The idea came from watching children throw flat stones across a river. Ben realized that at just the right height and speed, a bomb could do the same bounce once or twice on the surface of the water, then slam into the side of a ship at waterline level. It was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. The aircraft would have to fly straight and level at an altitude no higher than 200 feet, sometimes even lower. At that height, one burst of anti-aircraft fire could tear the bomber apart. The release timing had to be perfect, half a second too early, and the bomb would skip over the target. Half a second too late, and it would ricochet straight back into the plane. To test his theory, Ben's crews used a wrecked cargo ship stranded on a reef near Port Moresby, the SS Pruth, its rusted hull half submerged in the turquoise shallows. Day after day, pilots of the 43rd practiced attack runs. They flew so low that their propellers threw white spray off the waves. Navigators counted down the seconds to release, while bombardiers now retrained as spotters shouted corrections over the intercom. The first attempts were disastrous. Bombs, skipped wildly, exploded too soon, or missed entirely. But gradually the men learned the rhythm of it, the glide, the release, the lift of the nose just before the explosion. One pilot compared it to throwing a rock so hard the sea itself jumps. Another said, "You could feel the air compress against the surface. You were racing your own bomb." Ben recorded every run, adjusting for speed angle and altitude. He discovered that 250 feet of altitude, a speed of 220 miles per hour, and a release distance of about 600 yards, gave the most reliable results. Fitted with 500-pound demolition bombs armed with 4 or 5-second delay fuses, the weapon would punch through a ship's hull before detonating inside. The crews who mastered skip bombing knew exactly how thin the margin of life was. Flying at mast height meant they could see the faces of men on deck. At that range, even a single hit from a 25 mm gun could shred an engine or kill a pilot. Every training mission felt like combat, and every mistake ended with wreckage scattered along the reef. Yet the results were undeniable. After weeks of practice, the pilots of the 43rd Bombardment Group could hit a stationary ship 9 times out of 10. Moving targets would be harder, but not impossible. In January 1943, Ben's commanding officer invited General George Kenney to watch a live demonstration. As the B-25 came in low over the water, Kenney could see its reflection racing just below the fuselage. At precisely 600 yards, the bomb dropped, hit the surface, skipped once, and struck the hulk of the Pruth. A moment later, the wreck exploded in a geyser of flame and seawater. Kenney stared for a long time before turning to Ben. "That," he said, "is how we're going to end Japan's shipping." The 5th Air Force began combining gun strafers with Ben's skip bombers. The plan was elegant and brutal. The strafers would go in first, unleashing 8.50 caliber guns to silence anti-aircraft positions and bridge crews. Seconds later, the bombers would follow, releasing their bombs so close that the explosions would lift ships out of the water. The Japanese defenses designed to track high-altitude or torpedo attacks would be useless against this 2-stage assault. The crews trained relentlessly. They learned to fly in tight formation at 50 feet to approach from the sun or from the direction of the wind, to synchronize gunfire and bomb release so precisely that the entire attack lasted less than a minute. At dawn and dusk, the airstrips at Port Moresby thundered with engines as pilots practiced until the horizon blurred. Mechanics painted shark mouths and nicknames on the noses of the aircraft, Ruthless Little Hellion Barbie III. Each represented not just a bomber, but a promise that the next convoy to sail under the rising sun would not survive the encounter. By late February 1943, intelligence reports confirmed what they had been waiting for. A Japanese convoy, 8 transports and 8 destroyers, was moving toward Lae to reinforce New Guinea. To the Japanese, it was a routine resupply mission. To the Americans and Australians, it was the perfect test of everything they had built in secret, the strafer gunships, and the skip bombing doctrine that defied logic. At Eagle Farm and Port Moresby, armorers checked fuses and loaded belts of ammunition. Pilots studied maps of the Bismarck Sea, tracing attack routes with grease pencils. The air smelled of gasoline and wet soil. Men slept beside their planes, afraid to miss the call. For most of them, it would be their first low-level combat. For some, it would be their last. But they understood what was at stake. If the attack succeeded, it would cripple Japan's ability to move troops across the Pacific. If it failed, thousands of Japanese soldiers would land safely at Lae, and the bloody campaign for New Guinea would continue. In the early hours of March 3rd, Ben's crews climbed aboard their B-25S. They strapped themselves in, tightened their harnesses, and waited for the engines to roar. The sun was still below the horizon, and a faint drizzle swept across the field. Someone shouted a prayer. The propellers spun, kicking dust into the air. The smell of fuel mixed with sweat. One by one, the bombers lifted into the darkness, their navigation lights blinking over the jungle canopy. Far to the north, the convoy they were hunting had no idea what was coming. The Japanese officers on watch would soon see tiny black dots on the horizon, skimming the waves like seabirds, the first sign that the laws of warfare were about to change forever. If you think you could have flown that low under enemy fire, type 2 in the comments. If you believe no man should ever have to hit like, and make sure to subscribe, because in the next part, the sky over the Bismarck Sea erupts into flame as the Americans strike. At precisely 10:00 a.m., the lookouts aboard Admiral Kimura's flagship Shirayuki spotted silver flashes high above the horizon. The men shaded their eyes against the morning glare and pointed skyward. A formation of American bombers, B-17Es, approached at roughly 7,000 feet. Kimura lowered his binoculars and nodded calmly. This was expected. For months, American high-altitude bombers had attacked Japanese convoys with little success. Their bombs fell harmlessly into the sea, sometimes close enough to send up columns of spray, but never close enough to hit. "Maintain course," Kimura ordered. The air defense officers moved into action, shouting range and bearing coordinates. Every destroyer in the convoy elevated its guns toward the approaching aircraft. The Japanese had practiced this hundreds of times. Anti-aircraft gunners loaded belts of ammunition, adjusting sights for altitude and wind. In minutes, the sky above the convoy filled with black bursts of flak. The thunder of 25 mm cannons rolled across the sea like distant drums. But as the crews focused upward, no one saw what was coming in low. Barely 15 miles away, skimming just above the Ocean 12, B-25, Mitchells of the 3rd Attack Group and 13 Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters were racing in at wave-top height. Their propellers churned up mist behind them. The sunlight flashed off their aluminum fuselages, each nose bristling with 8 machine guns. Major Edward Ed Liner, commanding officer of the 90th Bombardment Squadron, led the first attack. His aircraft bore the name Ruthless painted in black across the nose. Through his windshield, he could already see the columns of water rising from the B-17 bombs, exploding far above. The Japanese gunners were doing exactly what he hoped. They were looking in the wrong direction. At 280 miles per hour, Ruthless roared toward the Japanese destroyer Shirayuki. From the bridge, sailors suddenly noticed something glinting on the horizon. At first, they thought it might be low-flying reconnaissance planes. Then, someone shouted, "Teki low, low." The cry rippled across the deck. Gunners scrambled to swing their weapons downward, but the planes were already too close. Liner pressed the trigger. 8.50 caliber guns erupted at once. The entire nose of Ruthless exploded in flame and thunder. To the Japanese crew, it was as if a wall of light had appeared out of nowhere, tearing through steel and flesh alike. The first stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds struck Shirayuki's bridge at 2,900 feet per second. The window shattered, spraying glass across the command deck. Metal plates buckled. Men vanished in bursts of sparks and smoke. Within seconds, every gun crew exposed on deck was hit. Lieutenant Takashi Miyata, one of the few survivors, later recalled, "It was like being trapped inside a machine shop. As every wall caught fire, the air itself screamed." Liner held his trigger for 8 full seconds, firing nearly 900 rounds before releasing 2 500-pound bombs fitted with 5-second delay fuses. The bombs skipped twice, then struck the destroyer just below the waterline. The explosions blew Shirayuki's midsection apart. Steam and smoke burst upward as the ship began to list to port. Behind Ruthless, 11 more B-25s came in one after another, each selecting a new target. Lieutenant John Hennebrey, flying the aircraft nicknamed the Hare, aimed for the transport Kaikusai Maru. His 8 guns walked a line of fire from the bow to the stern, shredding the bridge and silencing every anti-aircraft position before his bombs hit. The ship's captain never had a chance to give orders. The helm was gone, his crew either dead or wounded. The Beaufighters followed close behind, flying even lower, some barely 20 feet above the surface. Their 420 mm cannons and 6 machine guns hammered the upper decks of the transports, cutting down any gunners who still tried to return fire. Flight Sergeant Fred Cassidy of No. 30 Squadron RAAF later described it, "You could see the men on deck, their guns flashing. Then our cannons hit, and it was like watching the deck disintegrate. One moment there were shapes, the next there was just smoke and splinters." The air over the convoy turned into chaos. Ships wove in desperate maneuvers, throwing up plumes of white foam. The water boiled with tracer fire. Explosions echoed across the sea as bombs skipped across the waves, striking hulls and detonating deep inside. The Taimei Maru took a direct hit near the engine room, flames pouring from her ventilation shafts. The Nojima Maru was struck by 2 bombs that ripped her open like a tin can. On the destroyer, Arashio Commander Kiyoshi Sugino tried to shield the transports by steering between them and the attackers. His courage only made him a better target. 3 B-25s turned their fire on him simultaneously, unleashing a combined storm of 24 machine guns. The Arashio's bridge vanished in an eruption of fire and debris. Its rudder jammed hard to starboard. Moments later, the out-of-control destroyer collided with the transport Nojima Maru. Both ships locked together, burning furiously as ammunition and fuel ignited. For the Japanese sailors who survived the first wave, it was as if the laws of war had been rewritten in front of them. There were no warning sirens, no altitude calls, no evasive maneuvers that worked. The attackers came too fast and too low to track. The sound of the B-25's guns' 8 barrels hammering in unison was unlike anything they had ever heard. It wasn't the staccato chatter of normal machine guns, but a continuous roar, a mechanical scream that shook the air. Admiral Kimura stood on the deck of his flagship and stared at the destruction. In every direction, ships were burning. Columns of black smoke rose thousands of feet into the sky. The Kembu Maru, his largest transport, had taken 2 hits and was sinking stern first. Men were jumping overboard, their uniforms on fire. The sea, once calm and blue, was now streaked with oil and flame. From above, Linner's gunner watched the scene unfold through the rear turret. "It was like hell had opened on the ocean," he said later. "Everywhere you looked, something was exploding." The entire attack lasted less than 15 minutes. When the last B-25s pulled away, climbing low over the burning wreckage, 4 Japanese destroyers and all 8 transports were either sinking or aflame. Thousands of soldiers and sailors were struggling in the water. The survivors could still hear the echo of the guns fading into the distance, like thunder rolling away from a storm that had already passed. One Japanese officer, standing waist-deep in the sea beside his overturned lifeboat, watched a transport explode nearby and whispered, "We never saw them coming." If you believe this was the moment Japan's naval power began to break Type 3 in the comments, if you think they still had a chance to recover, hit like. And remember to subscribe, because what happened next would show the true cost of 15 minutes in hell. When the last American bombers disappeared over the southern horizon, the Bismarck Sea fell into an eerie silence broken only by the crackle of burning oil and the distant cries of drowning men. Admiral Masatomi Kimura remained on the bridge of his flagship, staring through a haze of smoke at what had once been his convoy. It had taken only 15 minutes. 15 minutes to turn 8 transports and 8 destroyers, Japan's lifeline to New Guinea, into a floating graveyard. The sea that had been calm and bright that morning was now black with fuel and debris shimmering under the orange light of flames. The flagship Shirayuki, once the pride of his escort line, was gone. Only a patch of burning oil marked where she had been. The destroyer Arashio was dead, in the water, locked against the side of the transport Nojima Maru. Both vessels burned from bow to stern ammunition, cooking off in bursts that sounded like fireworks. Men leaped into the sea to escape the heat, their uniforms catching fire as they hit the surface. Others clung to floating wreckage, faces slick with oil, screaming for help that would never come. Kimura gave orders to organize rescue operations, but the surviving destroyers were themselves damaged and on fire. The Asagumo tried to maneuver closer to pick up survivors, but within minutes it was attacked by another wave of B-25 SE returning to strafe the wreckage. The low-flying gunships swept the decks clean with gunfire, killing crewmen as they tried to haul their comrades aboard. Even men who had already jumped into the water found no mercy, the Americans following orders to prevent any reinforcement from reaching Leh, strafed lifeboats and swimmers alike. For the Japanese sailors, there was no direction to run. The air stank of burning fuel and cordite. The sea boiled where oil caught fire. One survivor later described the horror the water itself was burning. The heat came up from below and the sky was red above. There was nowhere left to look that wasn't on fire. In the transport Kaikusei Maru, hundreds of soldiers from the 51st Division had been trapped below decks when the first bombs hit. As the ship sank, they tried to climb toward the hatches, only to find them jammed shut by twisted metal. Others jumped from portholes into the burning sea, their rifles and helmets dragging them under. Some made it to the surface, only to be sucked down again by the vacuum of sinking hulls. In the chaos, discipline and rank dissolved. Men shouted for mothers, for gods, for air. Lieutenant Takashi Miyata, one of the few officers to survive, later wrote, "I heard men calling to each other, but the voices stopped, one by one. A hand reached for me from the water, but when I grasped it, it came away at the wrist. I cannot forget the weight of that hand." By 10:30 a.m., less than half an hour after the first bombs had fallen, the Bismarck Sea was unrecognizable. The burning ships drifted aimlessly, colliding with one another as flames devoured their wooden decks. Explosions erupted at random as munitions and fuel tanks ignited. Every blast sent shockwaves rippling across the oil-covered water, flipping bodies and lifeboats alike. Overhead, the smoke rose in pillars so thick that American reconnaissance aircraft could see them from over 50 miles away. Kimura's surviving destroyers, Asashio Yukikaze Shikinami and Uranami, tried to regroup. They threw ropes and nets over their sides, pulling aboard anyone still alive. The decks were slick with blood and oil. Corpsmen worked without morphine or bandages, tearing their own shirts into strips. The wounded were laid in rows on the steel decks, some still clutching letters that had survived the fire, others whispering prayers to ancestors whose names they could barely remember. In the water, sharks had begun to gather. At first they fed on floating debris and fish drawn by the carnage. Then they began to take men. Survivors described the sea erupting around them as fins sliced through the oil. Screams cut short as men vanished beneath the waves. For those left floating, it became a choice between burning and drowning. Many chose the latter. By early afternoon the attack was over, but the suffering continued. The burning hulks of the transport smoldered through the day and into the night. The ocean glowed faintly from the fires, still burning on the surface, a red and orange reflection that flickered like a dying sun. the sky filled with smoke that drifted for miles visible even from the airfields at Leh. American pilots circling back to assess the damage could hardly believe what they saw. Major Edward Liner wrote in his logbook, "We didn't need to count ships. You could see them sinking, one by one. It looked like the end of the world." By nightfall, the convoy was gone. Of the 900 soldiers who had left Rabaul, fewer than 200 would ever see land again. The rest, nearly 700 men, were dead or missing, many still trapped inside their ships, entombed in the cold darkness below. When Japanese submarines arrived after dark to search for survivors, they found a sea of floating corpses and wreckage. The smell of fuel and death hung heavy in the air. The submarine's crews worked in silence, pulling aboard the few men still alive, their eyes wide and blank. The radio reports they sent back to Rabaul were short and staggering convoy destroyed. Total loss, survivors minimal. Admiral Kimura never recovered from what he saw that day. In his after-action report written weeks later, he could not bring himself to describe the battle in tactical terms. Instead, he wrote only one line: "The sea itself was our enemy." At dawn the next morning, as smoke still drifted across the water, a few sailors on the damaged destroyer Yukikaze gathered on deck to pray. One of them, a young seaman named Hiroshi Nakata, placed a folded paper crane into the sea. It floated for a moment, then caught fire as it touched an oil slick. He watched it burn until it was gone. War had never seemed so absolute, so mechanical, so final. In 15 minutes, a single innovation, 8 machine guns, and a new way to drop bombs had wiped out an entire Japanese division and crippled the Navy's faith in its own invincibility. The Pacific would never look the same again. If you believe war always destroys more than it ever wins, type WAR in the comments. If you think human invention inevitably leads to tragedy, hit like. And remember to subscribe, because the aftermath of this battle would change Japan's entire naval strategy and the world's understanding of modern warfare. When the first fragments of news from the Bismarck Sea reached Rabaul, disbelief turned to silence. Officers gathered around the decoded radio message, reading it twice, to be certain it was real. 8 transports and 4 destroyers lost thousands dead, Admiral Kimura among the survivors, but wounded mission failed. The scale of destruction was unthinkable. Never in the Imperial Navy's history had an entire convoy been wiped out in a single daylight attack. It was not just a tactical defeat, it was the collapse of everything Japanese naval doctrine believed to be true. In Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the report in his private office at Combined Fleet Headquarters. Those present later recalled that he read it slowly without expression, then placed the papers down and said quietly, "If this is true, then we no longer control the sea." For the commander who had once orchestrated the triumph at Pearl Harbor, it was a sentence heavier than defeat itself. The empire he had helped build now faced an enemy that could strike anywhere at any time without warning. Until that moment, Japan's surface fleet had relied on speed, discipline, and firepower. Convoys were protected by layers of destroyers, their anti-aircraft guns forming what they called the umbrella of steel. It had worked for nearly 2 years. But the Bismarck Sea shattered that illusion. No umbrella could stop bombs that skipped like stones, or machine guns that cut through armor faster than human reflexes could respond. Within days, the Navy's operational planners convened an emergency meeting at Rabaul. Charts and maps covered the tables, red circles drawn to mark the range of American aircraft from bases in Australia and New Guinea. The conclusion was immediate and devastating. Every major convoy route in the South Pacific now lay within reach of B-25 strafers and their escorting fighters. Moving supplies by day was suicide. Even heavily armed destroyers were powerless against aircraft that attacked at wave height and could strike from beyond radar range. The new order was clear surface resupply would henceforth take place only at night. Troop transports were abandoned. Smaller vessels, barges, and submarines would attempt to carry food, ammunition, and fuel in secret, slipping through the darkness. The Japanese called it Yasen Yuso, the night run. The Americans called it the Tokyo Express. But whatever the name, it was a desperate improvisation, and it could never replace the massive convoys that once carried entire divisions across the Pacific. The consequences spread far beyond the Bismarck Sea. Without steady resupply, the Japanese garrisons on New Guinea and the Solomon Islands began to wither. Soldiers who had once fought with discipline and confidence now starved in the jungle. Malaria, hunger, and exhaustion claimed more lives than enemy bullets. The defeat at the Bismarck Sea was not just the loss of ships. It was the death of logistics, the end of mobility. Statisticians within the Imperial Navy compiled the numbers each line another wound. Between March 1943 and the end of 1944, Japan lost over 60% of its merchant fleet. Nearly 1,500 vessels were sunk transport tankers, freighters, and destroyers. Many fell to the same combination that had destroyed Kimura's convoy, low-level strafing attacks and skip bombing runs by B-25S and their variants. What had once been a proud merchant marine became a list of names and hull numbers lost to history. Reports from survivors filtered back in the following weeks. Commanders described panic among their crews and almost superstitious fear of American aircraft. Sailors began referring to the B-25 as Hachime no Oni, the eight-eyed demon, for the 8 gun barrels that glared from its nose. Others called it the flying saw, claiming that the sound of its guns could slice through the air itself. Even experienced officers admitted that their men froze at the first sight of the bombers coming in low, their courage drowned by memories of the firestorm that had consumed their comrades. At the Naval Staff College in Tokyo, analysts struggled to understand what had gone wrong. One report concluded bluntly, "Our doctrine assumes the enemy will attack as we would. He does not." For centuries, Japan's military philosophy had valued discipline hierarchy and repetition virtues that had served well in battles of precision and control. The Americans, by contrast, had embraced improvisation. They changed tactics overnight, turned bombers into gunships, mechanics into engineers, and experiments into victories. It was, Yamamoto admitted privately, the purest expression of industrial warfare, the ability to adapt faster than the enemy could respond. For the Americans, the victory confirmed that the future of naval war no longer belonged to battleships or torpedoes. It belonged to machines like the B-25, fast, flexible, and deadly, and to the men who dared to reimagine how they were used. The 5th Air Force now had a weapon that could destroy entire convoys in minutes, a weapon that required neither fleet nor formation, only courage and ingenuity. In the months that followed, similar attacks became routine. Japanese convoys that attempted to run supplies to New Guinea, New Britain, or the Solomons were torn apart by Allied aircraft. Reports from surviving crews told the same story again and again: sudden appearance, blinding flashes, unending gunfire, and ships exploding within seconds. No amount of bravery or training could offset the speed and precision of the American onslaught. By late 1943, Admiral Yamamoto's fleet had been forced into a defensive crouch. Large-scale surface movements ceased almost entirely. The Imperial Navy, once master of the Pacific, had become a fleet of ghosts, hiding by day, moving only at night. Yamamoto's private diaries, recovered after the war, contained a line written shortly after the disaster: "It is not courage we lack. It is time." The enemy learns faster than we can think. In the United States, newspapers barely mentioned the battle. To the home front, it was one small victory in a distant ocean. But among pilots and mechanics, the Bismarck Sea became legend. It proved that improvisation could triumph over doctrine, that a handful of men in a makeshift workshop could alter the course of the war. Pappy Gunn's creation had turned from an experiment into a symbol of American ingenuity, the embodiment of an industrial giant's ability to think on its feet. The psychological divide between the two sides widened with every sinking. For Japanese sailors, each voyage became a prayer. For American air crews, it became a test of precision and nerve. The Pacific itself seemed to change character, no longer an open battlefield, but a place where one side hunted and the other hid. The old rules of naval warfare range tonnage formation gunnery no longer applied. A new law had been written in the smoke of the Bismarck Sea. Whoever could combine innovation with speed would rule the oceans. By early 1944, Japanese commanders no longer planned operations based on courage or numbers, but on absence where the Americans were not. Convoys sailed under moonless skies, hugging coastlines, their lights extinguished. Yet even then, radar-equipped Allied aircraft often found them. The destruction continued. What had begun as a single battle had become a permanent reality. The day after receiving the report, Yamamoto called his staff together. "We have been defeated not by their weapons," he said, "but by their minds." It was in its simplicity the truth. The empire that had stunned the world with the brilliance of Pearl Harbor was now being undone by the same innovation it had once claimed as its own. The war was no longer about who could build the biggest ship, but who could change the fastest. The Bismarck Sea had proven that the age of the battleship was over. In its place stood a new kind of warfare, industrial, inventive, relentless. The Americans would carry that lesson forward, turning their factories into arsenals and their ideas into weapons. And for Japan, the once proud master of the Pacific, the sea that had once carried its conquests, had become a prison of oil fire and memory. Years later, when the war had ended, and the wrecks of the Bismarck Sea had settled beneath layers of coral and silt, veterans from both sides would speak of that day with the same uneasy reverence. For the Americans, it was a moment of triumph, proof that creativity and mechanical genius could overcome doctrine and discipline. For the Japanese, it was the day when courage and tradition were swallowed by a new kind of warfare. Yet for everyone who had seen it, one truth remained: nothing in war would ever be the same again. The B-25 Strafer had begun as an act of desperation, a field modification born in a dusty hangar by men working with salvaged parts and half-formed ideas. But its success had revealed a truth deeper than any single victory in industrial war. Invention itself was a weapon. The 8 gun barrels that jutted from the Mitchell's nose symbolized not just power, but the ability to adapt, to turn necessity into advantage. It was this mindset, not simply firepower, that came to define the American way of war. After the Bismarck Sea, the idea spread. North American aviation began producing factory-built versions of guns modifications. Later variants of the B-25, especially the J-22 model, carried up to 18 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns. A flying arsenal capable of leveling small towns or obliterating convoys. Pilots began to view the aircraft not as bombers, but as hunters. When the 345th Bombardment Group, the Air Apaches, received their new strafers, they painted shark mouths across the noses and called them flying battleships. The Pacific skies became their hunting ground. By late 1943, the B-25 Strafer had redefined Allied air tactics. Squadrons developed new methods for attacking ships' airfields, even coastal defenses. At dawn raids over Rabaul and Wewak, entire harbors vanished in minutes. Japanese observers described the sound of the approaching aircraft as a rolling drum fire that devoured the air itself. To those on the receiving end, it no longer felt like being attacked by planes, but by a moving factory of destruction, a symbol of America's industrial might made airborne. And yet among those who flew them there was little celebration. The pilots and gunners who returned from missions carried the weight of what they had seen: ships exploding, men leaping into fire, the sea turning red. Major Edward Liner, who had led the first wave over the Bismarck Sea, later admitted, "We didn't cheer when we landed. We just sat there. It felt like we'd seen too much." In his later years, he would visit museums where B-25s hung silent in perfect restoration, their polished aluminum skins gleaming under lights. "They don't make a sound anymore," he said, "but I still hear it." For Japan, the legacy was equally haunting. The B-25's victory forced the Imperial Navy into a shadow war of secrecy and survival. The convoys that once sailed under the sun now crept through moonless nights, moving silently through waters they once ruled. The defeat at the Bismarck Sea became a lesson written into every naval cadet's education. After the war, underestimate innovation and tradition becomes a liability. In the post-war years, military engineers across the world studied the concept that Pappy Gun had pioneered, an aircraft transformed into a gun platform capable of concentrating overwhelming fire on a single target. The idea resurfaced 2 decades later in the jungles of Vietnam. There, the U.S. Air Force resurrected the principle in the AC-47 Spooky gunship, arming a transport plane with side-firing miniguns that rained death in glowing arcs across the dark canopy. Its successor, the AC-130 Spectre, carried even greater firepower cannons, autocannon sensors, all echoing the same innovation born at Eagle Farm. And further still, in the late 20th century, the lineage of the Strafer could be seen in the A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog. Like its ancestor, it was ugly, durable, and devastating. Its GAU-8 Avenger cannon, firing 3 900 rounds per minute, was the modern equivalent of the B-25's 8 guns. The same principle endured an aircraft designed not just to deliver weapons, but to become one. Historians have often called the B-25 Strafer the most successful field modification in aviation history. But to those who built and flew them, success was never the word they used. They called it added survival. For every innovation that changed the course of war, there was a human cost that could not be measured in statistics. The wrecks of Shirayuki Nojima Maru and Kaikusai Maru still lie scattered across the seabed, twisted and silent. Inside some of them, the remains of soldiers still rest, their names long forgotten. In 1969, divers from Papua New Guinea discovered one of the wrecks, a transport split cleanly in half, its steel hull pierced in dozens of places by what looked like saw cuts. They thought at first it had been torn apart by explosives, but closer examination revealed hundreds of neat circular holes, each one the exact diameter of a .50 caliber bullet. Even after decades underwater, the evidence of what had happened remained. Today, the sea over those wrecks is calm again. Schools of fish drift through rusted corridors where soldiers once stood. Coral grows over the twisted steel, softening the outlines of destruction. Above, sunlight filters through the water in golden shafts, touching the guns, the railings, and the bones of ships long gone. The surface of the Bismarck Sea is smooth, but beneath it lie the traces of innovation and tragedy intertwined. It is tempting to call the B-25 Strafer a triumph of American ingenuity, and, in a sense, it was. It proved that courage and creativity could reshape the battlefield, that the workshop could be as decisive as the front line. But to those who watched entire convoys vanish beneath the sea, the memory carried another lesson, that every leap in invention also deepens the abyss of destruction. Major Pappy Gun never lived to see the full impact of his creation. He died in 1957 in a plane crash near the Philippines. On his desk at home, they found a note written in his hand. "We built them fast because men were dying faster." For him and for so many others, the line between necessity and genius had always been thin. Standing today on the shores of Papua New Guinea, one can still look out over the Bismarck Sea and imagine that morning in 1943, the calm, the smoke, the thunder, and the silence that followed. Somewhere below, among the coral and sand, lie the remains of ships and men who witnessed the moment when war itself changed form. The 8 gun barrels that once jutted from the noses of American bombers now rest in museums and memorials, their metal dulled by time. But they remain symbols of a truth that transcends nations and victories. In war, the tools that define progress often carry the weight of what they destroy. And as the waves roll gently over the graves of March 3, 1943, the sea keeps its secret, a quiet monument to ingenuity, to devastation, and to the fragile boundary between them.